Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. In the last podcast, we talked about US economic chaos because I recorded that just after Liberation Day, April the 2nd. And now, a week later, all of Trump's retaliatory tariffs have been delayed for 90 days, except for those on China. And even with those, there are some exceptions. Not that this huge issue is getting very much coverage in Australia because we are in the middle of a lackluster election campaign with politicians from all sides focusing on very narrow domestic issues. The big picture for people who have not been following international developments pretty closely is that trade between the US and China is effectively coming to an end. And this is a development which is going to have huge ramifications on the national security front for numerous countries, including Australia. But I think because of these developments, which will be very difficult to reverse, many countries in our region, such as Vietnam and Indonesia, might now be more inclined to move a bit closer to China. That's also a possibility for both the Republic of Korea and Japan. Added to that, India as well will probably be reassessing its growing relationship with the US, and in the light of the erratic and economically destructive way that the Trump administration is behaving, they might also be more inclined to look at ways of deepening their economic and security ties with China. Now, the exception to that is Australia, which looks set to continue a position of just constant grovelling to the United States. And I'll remind people, not that this is, an exercise in constantly bashing Donald Trump, but he has failed with Gaza. Remember that he was going to sort that out very quickly, turn the region into condos or whatever. He's comprehensively failed with Ukraine. The fighting there is going on, with Russia continuing to ceaselessly attack and prevaricating when it comes to a ceasefire. And I think the direction that the US is heading on that is that Trump is getting sick and tired of it all. He'll declare that failure to secure a ceasefire is all Ukraine's fault, and he will once again throw that country completely under the bus. I'm also worried about the slightly longer-term consequences for the independence of Taiwan, because the US has become completely transactional, and if Trump sees that there is an opportunity to negotiate some sort of special deal with President Xi of China, he may well say, Taiwan, all of Asia falls under your sphere of influence. I'm going to concentrate on North America. No one cares about South America or Africa, and all of Eastern Europe is in Russia's sphere of influence. That's my big fear. And just look at Australia's geography. We're obviously in the Asian region, so I would assume, if I'm right, that we will, one way or another, end up in China's sphere of influence. So let's talk a little bit about Australia. We are obviously a US ally, and still we have been hit with the 10% tariff, despite having a free trade agreement with the US. It's clearly a broken agreement. I'm actually curious about how this will affect Australian sales to the US of the small amounts of military hardware stuff that we make, because if those exports, and I'm talking about, say, components theoretically for Virginia-class submarines, if they are hit with a basic 10% tariff and a further 25% on top of that for anything containing Australian steel or aluminium, they will be instantly uncompetitive. And I informally contacted the CEOs of a couple of the larger defence companies, and I won't name them, we were speaking privately, they basically say they just don't know what is going on, whether the export of defence technology will be hit with tariffs. And that lack of clarity seems to be fairly representative because no one appears to know exactly what is happening, because the situation in the United States is changing daily. Now, that's clearly a problem for business planning, but it's also a recipe for corruption at a massive level, and there have been many claims just in the last few days of market manipulation by the Trump administration to benefit all of his billionaire donors. And the messaging has changed from tariffs will bring factories back to the United States to now it's a chance to negotiate individual deals with separate countries. I think that's all rubbish, and Australia should not be playing that particular game. Though if the government is re-elected, it looks like they are planning to do something with rare earth minerals. I've mentioned this before. If something like that goes ahead, I think that it would send completely the wrong signals to the US that we will just buckle under and do what we are told. And I'll have a bit more to say about this in a moment. The US is changing rapidly, and in my opinion, not for the better. It is moving further away from Australian norms and is clearly aligning itself with Russia. Its own values are rapidly shifting. They have a government now threatening its allies with invasion, is hitting them with tariffs when they've done nothing wrong, is selectively ignoring the rulings of its own courts, and is arbitrarily rounding up and deporting people who in some cases have done nothing wrong to third countries. Even some Australians have been caught up now in the changed US visa process. I understand that a few Australian academics are too scared to go there now, and it won't be long before some journalists share those concerns, like me, just for speaking these words. To get into the US as a working journalist, you have to go through one of the most intrusive processes of any countries to obtain what's called an I visa, the letter I for indigo, which involves answering from memory about 100 questions, many of them patently ridiculous, like are you a member of a terrorist organization? But then also there's an in-person interview where you are next to about 20 other supplicants screaming questions and answers into microphones to staff behind thick armoured glass. My own I-visa expires in 2027, and in the unlikely event that I'm granted a new one, I'll be a touch apprehensive about what will happen when I arrive, but that's enough about me and my personal concerns. Now, the Trump administration appears to have lent on Australia, this is now real-world consequences, to nationalise the port of Darwin, because currently its ownership is held by the Chinese company Landbridge. It's actually a 99-year lease. Now, 2 separate security reviews have already concluded that this Chinese ownership makes absolutely no difference as to how the port operates. There are no security implications whatsoever. But apparently that's not good enough for Washington, which has twisted the arm of our invertebrate Defence Minister Richard Marles, and who typically refuses to either confirm or deny what is going on. And I've got to acknowledge that the story was broken by ABC defence reporting dynamo Andrew Green, and on a quiet day I'll tell you the story about how his car keys went missing for more than a month. I think it helps sometimes with these anecdotes so that people can understand that we journalists are in fact human beings. Well, most of us are. Anyway, getting back to nationalising the port, it won't be easy because Landbridge doesn't want to sell, or let me state it another way. governments can compulsorily acquire anything they like, land needed for an expressway, or the very rare occasions, given this is Australia, where a bit of railway needs to be conducted. They can do that to the Port of Darwin, but it's going to cost, because under the law, compensation has to be paid, and I anticipate that in the case of Landbridge, the amount is going to be huge. So this is the Australian government, as usual, caving in to the ideological nonsense of anti-China extremists in Washington, with Australian taxpayers, that's you and me, footing the bill. Now, how to categorise the situation overall? One of my favourite historical movies is a German epic called The Downfall, and it is set in Berlin in the concluding days of the Second World War. It's basically even narrower than that. It's in the Führer bunker. And the movie very powerfully makes the point of just how totally deluded Adolf Hitler and his inner circle had become, when it was plain to everyone that the Third Reich was coming to an end, that huge Red Army forces were on the march, and there was just no way that Germany was going to be able to continue the fight and resist. But in the mind of Hitler and some of the others, he continued to sort of move non-existent units around the big map table and come up with these fanciful scenarios about how victory could be snatched from the jaws of defeat. You're probably thinking, where am I going with this description of a movie? One of the most powerful scenes, climactic scenes in it, is when a couple of Hitler's generals finally have the nerve to tell him the truth, that one of the attacks that he had ordered, which he was convinced was going to ensure victory, just didn't happen, because the general concerned just didn't have enough men and didn't have enough equipment. And Hitler flies into this towering rage. And that scene, by the way, is the source of many parodies on the internet. You can find them, quite readily, because it's such a powerful scene with this man completely losing control when he is forced to confront reality. So, where am I going with this? This is how I see the current Australian political leadership. I can see Albo and Richard Marles and Penny Wong, and with Kevin Rudd somewhere in the background, and defence and foreign affairs bureaucrats sort of packed into the room, and they're all staring at the huge map table of the world, which for this analogy represents Australia's relationship with the United States, and they're moving these fictitious things around. Well, we've got AUKUS here, and we've got ANZUS, and we'll advance this minerals deal, and maybe we'll give them another base. Maybe we'll give them something else for free. And I find that is just all one gigantic fantasy. The world has changed. The United States has changed. We have to just accept that reality. But while I'm doing my little history lesson here, my perspective on history, an early characteristic of the Nazi regime in the 1930s was the development, the exploitation of the concept of the big lie. Now, throughout human history, people have lied, but Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, was pretty good at more formalizing this, basically saying, in a sense, the bigger the lie, the better. And just by repeating it over and over and over again, people would eventually accept that it was true. This is happening, I believe, in the Australian security space, and there are two current whoppers. The first is the one that I've been dealing with, that the US remains a reliable ally, that nothing at all has changed, nothing to worry about. I've dealt with that one. And the second huge lie is that our own defence expenditure is rising. Well, I mean, technically it rises by a few dollars a year because of inflation. So in that sense, every year is a record year, but when you do the analysis, we're going backwards. Now, that's something the government denies, but I've got some hard data. There's an organisation out there, you can find them on the internet, Tender Trace, and they are very good at providing detailed analysis of government contracting. And I'll just read from their most recent report, which talks about last financial year. The Australian federal government's FY23 spending saw a notable downturn, significantly manifested in the Department of Defence. Despite allotting contracts worth $27.5 billion to over 5,000 vendors, the department experienced an 18% drop compared with the last financial year. I'll emphasise that, an 18% drop in spending compared with the previous financial year. That's a disaster for industry. Anyway, the report continues. Nevertheless, as of this report's publication, the Department of Defence stands at the nation's top as the nation's top spending government department. It has over 11,000 active contracts valued at $170 billion, making up 41% of all other federal government departments and agencies' active contract values. And there are a couple of dot points. $27.5 billion awarded by Defence in the previous financial year. $2.7 billion of spending under the military rotary wing aircraft procurement category. That's the Black Hawks and the Apaches that I've dealt with previously, and I will definitely return to again in the future. And again, just underlining the conclusion of an 18% decline in the department's spend. This is a dismal picture, and it's just going to have to increase, especially because of the need to start decoupling from our overdependence on US military hardware, for the simple reason that we can no longer be guaranteed the supply of spare parts no matter what. Those days are gone. I've previously referenced the AUKUS conference hosted by Malcolm Turnbull on March 31st, and while there was a broad consensus that Australia just has to diversify sources of military equipment, there was indeed some pushback, and one of the interventions came from former bureaucrat Mike Pizzullo, who I've never had a lot of time for. I can elaborate on that in future. And unfortunately, he is known to many of we long-term Canberra residents. His contribution was to demand, rather theatrically, I thought, how would Australia survive without Mark 48 heavyweight torpedoes or advanced air-to-air missiles? Well, Mike, no one is talking about putting every US-made item on a large barge, towing it out to sea and sinking it. What we are talking about is gradual replacement of US equipment with, for example, much more from South Korea, which is equally high quality, can be built in Australia with a full transfer of intellectual property, and is a lot less expensive. We just have to stop this head in the sand, she'll be right approach to national security and the sanctity of the US alliance. Now, with an eye on the clock, I'll have to conclude here. Easter is coming up, and it's followed by another long weekend. So I plan to have a 2-week break, with the qualification that if anything really urgent happens, I'll revisit that. But also, I have to say, events in the US are just making my head spin, and I'll probably need just a 2-week break to retain what little remains of my sanity. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.